Welcome to Building the Future. I'm your host, Kevin Horick. You can check out new episodes of the show every Tuesday and Thursday at 2 p.m. If you missed an episode or want to get more information about the show, please visit buildingthefutureshow.com. Season 1 of the TV version of Building the Future is now streaming online at buildingthefutureshow.com. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Matthew Marcus, Executive Director at Kansas City Startup Foundation and co-leader of the Kansas City Startup Village. Matthew, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me, Kevin.
Yeah, I'm excited. I think how the whole kind of startup village kind of came together was kind of a really fascinating story for me and kind of why I really wanted to have you on the show. But maybe kind of before we get into that, let's get to know you a little bit better and maybe start off with where you grew up.
That sounds great. Yeah. So I grew up in Kansas City. I was actually born in the Southwest in Santa Fe, New Mexico, but my parents relocated to Kansas City very early on. I think I was 1 or 2 years old.
Got you.
So the majority of my upbringing was in Kansas City, and it's been a great place to be raised and to grow up. I did some traveling along the way and lived abroad in various places, but I've always called Kansas City home.
Sure. So what did you kind of take in university?
Yeah, so kind of a funny background on that. So for some reason, for a kid really from the Midwest, I fell passionately in love with the ocean. I've always been just enamored by the ocean. And so, as I had to kind of make decisions of, where I was going to take studies after high school, I thought, I'll be an oceanographer.
Sure.
Of course, I started looking at schools around the country in coastal regions, and the costs were far higher than that of in-state tuition. And so my parents kind of said, well, we're happy for you to go to any of these schools, but it's going to cost you a lot of money. We've saved a little bit enough for you to go in-state, but not so much out of state. So I kind of started to re-strategize, and I thought, what else I like to do is computers. I've just always been enamored by computers and electronics and stuff. And so I got my degree in computer science at the University of Kansas, Rock Chalk.
Sure. No, that's awesome. So was there kind of something growing up that kind of drew you to computers or what was that moment where you were kind of like, ooh, I really like this kind of stuff?
I think it probably started with the Atari.
Sure.
And I think I had one of those early on, and I just was fascinated by, this digital game of, I think it was either Pong or Berserk or something like that. But I just really enjoyed it. And I think, my first computer was an Apple IIc.
Sure.
And it ran, it allowed you to do some minuscule programming. And maybe it was at school that I kind of learned BASIC. It might have been like at a computer camp type course. And I just thought it was so cool that you could plug in like these words and these numbers and stuff and then hit go, and like magic would happen,
Totally.
Graphics would happen. And so I just was like, this is really neat. And then I think the problem solving element of programming really kind of stuck out to me. I was always kind of a tinkerer and a kind of a MacGyver, if you will, trying to solve things. And,
Sure.
And this was a digital way of doing that.
Well, that's awesome. So you graduate university. What did you end up doing? Did you go start working right away or kind of walk me through that?
Yeah, I did. So I graduated in 96 and then relocated from Lawrence back to Kansas City and got a job with a large telecommunications company that's headquartered here in KC. And, and worked kind of happily for about a year and a half, maybe 2 years. And then that's when kind of the disillusionment began for me.
Okay.
as a young adult.
Okay. So no, go ahead. Sorry.
Well, I can expand upon that if you'd like, or we
Sure.
can
Yeah, I'm kind of curious to know like how you kind of got to kind of the startup village.
Oh yeah. So essentially what happened is here I am working. I'm in Kansas City, and I started to feel that there was so much more out there. I felt like I was kind of living a sheltered life.
Okay.
My whole life up to that point was in and around Kansas. I'd done a little bit of traveling in various states and stuff with my parents and whatnot growing up, but I just thought, there's got to be more out there. And I started to think, how can I spread my wings? And at first I thought, well, I'll just move west I play a lot of ultimate frisbee, and I was really heavy into the ultimate frisbee community then. And Boulder, Colorado has a fantastic ultimate scene, so I thought I'll move that way. And then I realized I think I got to get out of the United States and see what the world has to offer. And I ended up selling all of my stuff and bought a one-way ticket to Australia and packed a backpack full of clothes and just, headed south.
Sure.
And, one of the best moves I've ever made in my life.
Sure. So how long were you in Australia?
So I backpacked for about 6 months,
Okay.
Ended up in Sydney, and kind of was faced with the decision of, do I go home or do I, see where else this road can take me? And I ultimately decided to stay down there, and I got a job doing programming and connected with their ultimate frisbee community and really just built a whole another life in a foreign country.
Interesting.
For about, like another year and a half. So about 2 years total, that stint. But there were several following that.
Sure. And then what made you kind of come back to the States in Kansas City?
Well, so as the story goes, I stayed down there for a while. I came back to Kansas City after about a year and a half, just because I could have stayed in Australia, quite honestly, forever. I just fell in love with it. But I kind of wanted to put life back into perspective a little bit and see friends and family. So I came back home, realized that I wasn't done traveling. I wanted to see more. So I backpacked Europe for about a year.
That's awesome.
Had a great time. Yeah, another fantastic. I can't express how much travel really does impact and change one's life, especially the views. But did that, came back home. That's when I kind of got introduced to the startups and stuff and what that was about. So I ended up moving to San Francisco, where I thought, I'm going to get a job with one of these startups. And ultimately, I didn't, because it was a .com bust at that time. But I did get a very cool job with a really fun magazine publishing company. And ultimately just realized that San Francisco wasn't Sydney. I thought it would be a replacement for it, but Sydney in Australia is just kind of a unique place in its own right. And so made my way back to Australia for a few more years, and then for some reason managed to find a Canadian girlfriend who relocated me to she wanted to go back to Canada, so we moved to Vancouver, Canada, and I lived there for several years. And then my mother fell ill with breast cancer, and I'm an only child and wanted to be at her side and really help her out. And that's what brought me back to Kansas City, and kind of the rest is history.
Sure. So, so then kind of walk me through, you're back in Kansas. How did you kind of get the village kind of started?
Yeah, so I guess just kind of the precursor to the village. So here I am in Kansas City. I'm building a life. I'm kind of doing a little sole proprietorship and doing a little web development, kind of my own little consulting practice.
Sure.
And an American expat who I had met in Vancouver reaches out to me and says, hey, I've got this idea for a startup company. We need a chief technical officer. Are you interested? And he proceeds to explain to me what eventually would become KULA Causes, the first startup that myself and he co-founded.
Sure.
And I said, yeah, great. This checks all the boxes. Let's do it. We were originally going to base it in Munich, Germany. So I went over there for about a month with him and a few others. And we ultimately decided that wasn't the right market. So we ended up basing it in Denver / Boulder. And I spent, a couple of years building that, kind of going back and forth between Colorado and Kansas. And then when I finished with that startup, I relocated back to Kansas City, and I was really kind of in a lost situation because, KULA Causes was my first startup, and I thought that was the end-all be-all. I thought this is the thing that's going to take me to the promised land. And
Sure.
When it kind of ended abruptly, I was very confused and lost into what was next. And that's when the serendipity of my involvement with Kansas City startup community and the village began.
Okay, interesting. So you're doing this startup. At what point or how did you decide to kind of let's set this thing up?
Yeah, so here I am back in Kansas City. I figure, okay, there's got to be some startup, something happening here. So somehow I ended up on meetup.com, found one startup event, led me to another one. I ended up meeting some other people in the community and a guy who would become my future business partner. His name is Adam Arredondo, and at the time he was kind of the darling child of this very nascent Kansas City startup community.
Gotcha.
And we had a pretty quick friendship. And he instantly said, "You got to go to this event. You got to go here. You got to start going to all these really neat things." And so I just kind of did what he told me to do. Again, we eventually became business partners, and it was at that time when, I guess I should backtrack a little bit. So my mother ends up passing away in 2010.
Oh, sorry about that.
And she was well, thank you. I appreciate that. She was a very connected individual with the community, especially the interior design and antiques community in Kansas City.
Got you.
And so there's this small part of town in Kansas City. It's called the historic Hanover Heights Arts and Antiques District. And she had a building very close to the center point of this small commercial district where she based her interior design and antiques business. So, of course, as an only child, I inherited this building. Her assistant carried on the business for a little while, but decided ultimately to move on. So I had this vacant building. I moved back to Kansas City, and I think I got to put this to use somehow. I mean, it's just sitting here doing no justice to the community or myself or anyone.
Sure.
So I put a for rent sign in the front yard, and that's kind of when I start to get, connected to Adam, and I start to figure out what this startup community is all about. And then, the real start begins with the Village story when Mike Farmer, who was CEO and founder of a startup at the time called Leap.it, he's operating in the same kind of antiques district, just in a small office space.
Okay.
He sees my for rent sign and reaches out to me and says, "Hey, I've got a tech startup company. We just closed some funding. I'd like to bring my regionally based development team under one roof. How would you feel about renting your antique house to a tech startup?" Now, of course, he has no idea that I'm a tech startup guy myself.
Sure.
So this is where
awesome,
serendipity starts to. Yeah, it was a really magical moment because I got real excited on the phone. I said, "Dude, I'm a startup guy. This is amazing." So we quickly, agreed upon a means to get him into the house. And it was shortly thereafter, probably within a week, that I ended up joining Adam Arredondo's tech startup company. And of course, we needed office space. And so we ended up taking the basement of my house along with Lepus, who took the upstairs, and we brought another startup with us. So all of a sudden we had a house full of 3 startups just, doing their thing.
That's awesome. And it sounds like this is within weeks or maybe a couple months of time by the time you had the third one?
Oh, yeah, weeks. So that literally, we had 3 startups in that house within probably a week, maybe 2.
That's awesome.
And the ironic part, which really gives the Village its flavor and flair, is as that's happening, Mike jumps across the street, moves into my house. He tells some startup buddies, "Hey, I'm moving out of this office space. You guys should come over here. It's a really neat space." So 2 more startups move into that space. And meanwhile, while this is happening, there's this gentleman named Ben Barrett, who's just a local web developer, who gets this kind of harebrained idea that, hey, Google Fiber chose Kansas City. This is pretty magical and special. And Kansas Cityans are so hospitable and Midwesterners are so nice that I'll bet you people would open up their homes and give literally rent-free living in spare bedrooms and closets and attics to entrepreneurs from around the country who would want to come to Kansas City and literally plug into Google Fiber to create just awesome stuff. And so he, it's a longer story, but he ends up creating this Homes for Hackers program.
That's
and
awesome.
ends up buying a house 3 houses away from my building, unbeknownst that I even had a building here or that any of this was happening.
Interesting.
So, so we ended up meeting Ben at a 1 Million Cups, which at the time was just only in Kansas City and very early in the program. And, we discovered, I got a house over in State Line. I got a house. And so, boom, all of a sudden you had 3 properties with this startup activity. And that's when it really started to happen.
That's awesome. I love that story. And I think it's inspirational, right? Because there's a lot of cities that don't have kind of a village or a little startup community, right? And the fact that you guys just kind of almost a little bit by accident ran into each other, right? Through networking and kind of just being involved in the community, put together something really great. And then it just happened to line up that Google Fiber came to Kansas City as well, right around the same time.
Yeah, it was exactly at that same time. In fact, the building that I own was the first house in the world to get Google Fiber.
Really?
The first public installation.
That's
yeah.
awesome. So did you
Yeah,
guys?
I got to tell that story because it's quite a humorous story. So
Sure.
Google Fiber contacted me and said, "Hey, we've got your installation date. We're going to come down and install your house on November 12th, 2012."
Did you reach out to them, or they reached out to you?
So they reached out to me. So the way the whole fiber thing works is, they broke up Kansas City into different fiber hoods, and each fiber hood had to reach a certain goal in order for everyone to qualify to get Google Fiber. And our fiber hood qualified like in 5 minutes. It was the quickest of all.
Okay.
And so I think that led them to say, "Hey, let's install this one first." And it probably helped that the Google Fiber space, kind of the public facing space for Google Fiber, is literally in the village down the street. So that was probably pretty helpful.
Sure,
but,
that's awesome.
Yeah, so, I guess just leading up to this story, so, we were seeing Google Fiber installing literally fiber in our neighborhood. I mean, they had the contractors stringing up fiber on the telephone poles and connecting house, putting up stuff into the houses and just doing all their work.
Sure.
And, I realized, many of us realized at the time, like, the world is literally watching Google Fiber do this for the first time, but most of them are watching from like a 30,000 foot view because they're nowhere close. They're somewhere else in the country or world.
Totally.
Yet it's happening in our backyard. So we started to blog about it. We started to take photos daily and started to chronicle like everything that we saw and just kind of tell the world, "Hey, check out what's happening."
That's really cool.
And so, So Google, just generally contacted me and said, "Hey, we've got your installation date to install Google Fiber." And so I said, "Great." And we decided we were going to live stream the installation because again,
cool.
no one had seen Google Fiber actually getting installed. And so we announced to the world, "Hey, tune in at this time." We had our exact time when they were going to come to install. And we said, "Watch our live stream. We're going to show you what it's like to get Google Fiber installed." Well, of course, Google Fiber's team and the Google execs caught wind that we were going to do this.
Sure.
Well, literally, they hadn't at the time even publicly announced to anyone that they were starting installation. They were already booking times before they had actually announced, "Hey, we're installing."
Interesting.
And they were actually having a public media event on November 13th, 2012.
Okay.
And so literally, we were kind of trumping their event by live streaming the installation. So they reached out to me and said, "Hey, we realize what you're doing. We think it's pretty cool, but do you mind if we postpone your installation date by 1 day? We'll invite you to the media event as being the first house to get Google Fiber. We'll kind of have the press there and all that stuff. And then we'll all literally walk down the street to your house and watch Google Fiber get installed, everybody. And you can live stream it and do all that stuff." So, of course, that was a no-brainer.
Sure.
That's
awesome.
So we did it, and it was a hell of an event. I mean, literally, this poor guy who was installing Google Fiber, he had probably 4 microphones from 4 different TV crews, and literally the Google execs from Mountain View kind of watching him every move, every step in the background to kind of, see how he did. He was a rock star. I mean, he nailed it, but it was just such an exciting event for everybody involved.
Sure, that's awesome. Is there a video somewhere of that install that people could look at?
Oh, absolutely. We have a press page on the KCSV website, Kansas City Startup Village website. You can scroll down. You'd have to scroll down quite a bit because we've had press since, but
sure.
There's definitely 3 or 4 videos from TV crews that recorded the action. And it's pretty humorous.
Yeah, no, that's awesome. I think some people would like to check that out, right?
Oh yeah, it's quite a hoopla, that's for sure.
Sure. So, all right, you get Google Fiber, you have a bunch of startups in the house and kind of the little community. At what point did you guys decide we should call this a startup village?
Yeah, so that gentleman Ben Barris, he sent the now famous email to kind of 5 or 6 of us, the early startups that were there on September 30th, 2012.
Okay.
And this was, of course, before we had Google Fiber, but he realized what was happening before it was happening.
Sure.
And he said, "Guys, something really cool is happening here. We got 3 properties with startup activity. We got Google Fiber coming along the way here shortly. This really could become a national hotspot for attention and startup activity in Kansas City.
Sure.
We should do something about this." And we kind of said, yeah, he's right. Let's do something about it. So we got together, broke out some beers and chips and salsa or pizza or whatever we had. And we literally just kind of, brainstormed and eventually came up with the name. Let's call it the Kansas City Startup Village. And that's what we did. And we came up, we had this guy design a logo for us, and then we threw up a website. And then literally it was like, well, what do we do now? Because at the time, none of us had any really startup community building experience or knowledge or really any insight of what we were doing. And so we just thought, well, let's just invite more entrepreneurs to join us, because it's more fun to drink beer with 10 people than 2 people,
Sure.
And so we did. We just kind of told Kansas City, we said, hey, we've got this little startup village over here. If anyone wants to come join us, like rent a house, buy a house, get a commercial space, and join the fun. And boom, it took off, especially when the media caught wind of what was happening.
Sure. I love that. So what's the difference between the Kansas City Startup Foundation and the Village?
Yeah, so fast forward a few years, here we've got this village, the media's taken wind, all of a sudden a lot of exposure, a lot of entrepreneurs and startups moving to the area. At the height of it, I think we had like 15 properties,
wow,
30 plus startups. And yeah, I mean, the village grew pretty quickly, all things considered. And the interesting side note, the way we based the village is on the guidelines that Brad Feld put forth in his book, Startup Community,
sure,
which again, more serendipity. He literally published and released this book right around the same time that all of this village thing was happening.
Okay.
And so, we get hold of this book, we read it, and we go, oh my God, like this is literally a guidebook on how to build this thing that we're trying to build. And one of the points that he makes in there is that it's got to be co-led. It's got to be led by entrepreneurs, and it can't have hierarchy. It can't have president or vice president or anything like that. It's really got to be co-led by entrepreneurs. And so that's what we did. And it was all volunteer effort. I mean, literally no one was getting paid. There was no funding. And yet here's this vibrant economic development piece for Kansas City that's just this very organic grassroots thing. So we realized as the years kind of went by that, like, this is awesome, but it's just not sustainable through volunteer efforts only. I mean, we had organizations and individuals that said, man, I'd love to support you, what you're doing with resources or even finances, but you're not even a business. You're just this kind of, mystical community, with just this kind of organic nature.
Sure.
And so we realized, like, all right, in order to get real proactive about what we're doing, we've got to get some sort of official capacity, wrapped around it. And so we thought about converting the village to a nonprofit, but we didn't want to lose that organic grassroots nature, and we didn't want to introduce red tape or hierarchy or anything like that into this really vibrant, organic community. So ultimately, we decided to start the Kansas City Startup Foundation on the side, with the original intent that it would be kind of a representative nonprofit for the village. If you want to support the village, you can do so through the foundation.
Got you. Okay. No, that's really cool. So obviously, depending on kind of the different startup villages throughout kind of North America and the world, you guys kind of do different things for startups. Do you maybe want to kind of just give me a quick overview, well, maybe not even quick overview, an overview of kind of what exactly the village does for the startups that are in the village? And I'm curious to know, like, do you guys like charge them rent or that kind of stuff, right? Like, what exactly do they get and what do they pay and whatnot?
Yeah. So, I mean, the village truly is an entrepreneur-led community. It is not, again, it's not a business. There's no official organizational capacity to it.
Sure.
It's really this kind of amorphous thing that ebbs and flows and kind of just does its thing.
I love that.
I guess a good way of, that's just the way it works the best. And in a way, it's kind of becoming a model for other, cities and whatnot who want this kind of organic kind of movement as well.
Sure.
So like, as far as like, you can kind of consider the Kansas City Startup Village like a living incubator.
Okay.
So, most people probably listening to this podcast would realize, understand that an incubator is this, it's usually an official organization. They have an official network of mentors. They might provide some equity or some funding to get equity or whatever it might be. The village is kind of its own supportive incubation community. And by that, I mean the entrepreneurs are in and of themselves their own network of mentors. So there's a lot of co-learning. Yeah, there's a lot of co-learning. I mean, no one's paid, but what happens is, what I don't know, the entrepreneur next to me at the co-working space or across the street might know, and vice versa.
Sure.
So there's a lot of knowledge share that happens, which is really fantastic. And as far as what they pay, there's no application to get into the village. There's no fees. None of that is involved. We've had quite a few people over the years, submit the join request form, and they expect us to say it costs this much a month or this much a year. And they're sometimes surprised that all we say is, look, you want to be a villager? Just rent a house, buy a house, get a commercial space, and you're a villager. And not only are you a villager, but you're also instantly a co-leader, which means that if you have an initiative or an idea that you think is going to benefit the community and help it prosper, go for it. You don't have to ask permission or anything. You just go for it and let us try to help you and support you in the initiative.
That's awesome.
So, so that's neat. And the thing is, when it comes to the properties, every property has its own story, its own kind of operational agreement. So, for example, my house, I've got 3 startups in there right now. They each pay, a bit of rent to use the space. There was another house that was literally purchased by 2 Hallmark VPs here in Kansas City who just loved what we were doing. They just really got passionate about the community and wanted to support it. They bought a house and rented it to a couple startups and had one entrepreneur living there full time. Brad Feld, the gentleman who I spoke about earlier, he actually heard that the village had based itself around his guidelines and principles, ends up buying a house in the village, sight unseen, to kind of support the movement. Yeah.
That's awesome.
Talk about a great guy.
Sure.
Yeah, really, really cool.
Has he been down after he bought the house?
He has. He's been to KC a few times.
Sure.
He's super busy and super high demand, but he's stayed in his own house.
Really?
He's visited it, and there's the house has provided amazing value to not only just the entrepreneurs that have lived and worked in it, but just the village and Kansas City overall.
Sure.
And I mean, I could go on and on about all these different stories for each property, but that's what makes it quite unique, is that there is no total owner of the properties or this kind of overlord by any means. It really, everyone's just independent in a way.
Right. So how many properties do you guys have currently?
So I was just doing a count today, actually. So we've got 14 properties.
Oh, wow.
That are considered part of the village. Yeah.
Wow. So how much, I guess, geographical region is that? Is it a few blocks? Is it, a few miles?
Yeah. So what we did early on, people would say, well, where's the boundary of this village? And well, of course, we didn't have one. We just said, it's wherever you guys. Yeah. We just didn't have anything. So we realized, we're like, okay, the power of a startup community like the village is density.
Sure.
Because the closer in proximity that entrepreneurs and startups are to one another, the more likely co-learning occurs or random serendipitous collisions occur.
Totally.
And so, we started to notice that even startups that were 3 or 4 or 5 blocks away, really the separation, you really started to feel it, and it was kind of exponential in their distance. So we kind of outlined an inner zone and an outer zone for the village. So the inner zone is about 2 blocks in radius.
Okay.
From the center point, and then the outer zone goes about 1 mile in radius.
Got you. Okay, that's still not that bad though. They're pretty close.
It's pretty good. We have a map on the village website where you can actually see pins where all the startup properties are and who's in those houses, and it really gives a nice visual to what I'm talking about.
Sure. No, that's awesome. So I'm kind of curious. You guys are obviously growing. You're doing really well. Where do you guys kind of see the foundation kind of taking the village in the future? Or is you don't really know? It's just kind of see where it goes. That's
like the golden question, I feel like, because in Brad's book, he talks about startup communities, and those who are co-leading it have to have this kind of continual 20-year vision.
Sure.
And as years pass by, you have to keep looking down the road, like, where is this going? Where are we taking this thing? And, who's involved and what's happening? So we try to do that with the village, but because things happen so quickly and conversations happen and serendipitous moments happen that can shift or kind of change direction, we kind of sometimes just have to go with the flow and try to keep the general guide or growth going in the right direction. With the foundation, it's interesting because as the organization has emerged, originally it was something that was just really solely going to focus on supporting the village. But we realized that here's this awesome organization that can do so much more for Kansas City startup and entrepreneur ecosystem than just support the village. So we're really using the Kansas City Startup Foundation to kind of help unify and champion Kansas City's overall startup community and all the stakeholders that play an important part of it. Of course, the village is something that we're also always going to champion and try to help grow. I can see the village. I could definitely see more entrepreneurs here. There's certainly a threshold because if you were to walk around the community, I mean, it's very much it's surrounded by residential neighborhoods. It's a very small commercial district. You don't get tall skyscrapers or huge buildings. So there really is a threshold to not only the number of entrepreneurs and startups that it could really support, but even the size of those kind of startup companies. We've had a handful that have what we call graduated from the village because they literally created so many jobs and grew in numbers that they couldn't fit anymore.
That's awesome.
So they kind of moved on to other startup hubs around Kansas City.
Sure.
And then of course, they're replaced by smaller ones. So I'd like to see more entrepreneurs. I'd like to see more startups, and I'd also like to find ways to provide as much value as we can to the startups and entrepreneurs that call the village home. Whether that's introductions to investors, whether that's programming or educational pieces. I think there's so many different avenues we could go down, but it really comes down to what is it that they want? What's the value that they need?
Sure. And I love your guys' approach to the whole thing, and that you're not kind of like, you don't really have a hierarchy. I think that's like a really, really interesting approach to this whole space and kind of what you guys are doing. And I think it's really cool.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that catches most people off guard that visit. We've had, I'm trying to do the numbers, but at least probably 3,000 to 4,000 visitors over the years that we've been here. Yeah, I mean, we've had foreign delegates from over 85 countries. We've had politicians from senators to congressmen, all the way down. We've had students. We get student groups coming through all the time, and we put on entrepreneurship panels so that they can literally learn from the entrepreneurs themselves what it's like to build and start a business. So that's something really magical to have come to the village, really.
Sure. So for obvious there's obvious reasons why these types of people come, but is it a lot of times they're trying to replicate what you guys are doing in their kind of city or town?
Yeah, it really is. I mean, the question that they ask most predominantly is how do we bring a village to our city?
Sure.
How do we do this thing? And I guess going kind of back to your last question, when they find out that it's like there is no hierarchy, there's no president, there's no formal business literally behind this thing. It's this kind of eyes go wide open, but they truly want to find out how to bring it. We looked up, like we thought, okay, we've got this village. This must be happening somewhere else. Like this can't be the only place, but we really could not find a similar type setup or community anywhere else that we looked or with people that we spoke to. And I think eventually we might even put together kind of our own little guidebook to, hey, create a village, startup village in your neck of the woods, and share, lessons learned and best practices that we've discovered over the years.
Sure. No, I think that would be awesome. And I think, and especially as a lot more cities kind of get fiber, either whether it's from Google or other providers, right? Or just as high-speed internet gets kind of more popular globally, I think a lot more cities are going to kind of do what you did.
Yeah, I think so. mean, gigabit networks is a fascinating thing in its own right. I really love to see how Google Fiber's, already starting to traverse to other cities. And in a way, we kind of want to work with those cities to see how we can collaborate as digital cities to other digital, or gigabit cities to other gigabit cities.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, the village itself is a very unique thing. And I guess, one thing to note that I really love that has not happened in Kansas City is that no one's tried to own it. Sometimes initiatives pop up in startup communities and someone feels as though they need to own it.
Right.
Whether it's a corporation or a government entity or, investment or whoever it might be, feels as though they need to own it, they need to lead it. And no one has ever done that with the village. It's literally, an entrepreneurial community for entrepreneurs by entrepreneurs. And that's what I think helps keep this very unique flavor and uniqueness to it.
Sure. No, I think that's great. But Matthew, we're kind of coming to the end of the show. So do you maybe want to, again, kind of close with just maybe like a quick overview of exactly what you give to the startup, and then mention where people can find you guys online and any other social media links you want to mention?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, again, like the village is all inclusive. We're open to any type of entrepreneurs that want to base themselves here.
Sure.
And if anyone's interested in kind of having a chat or wants to learn more about the story or wants some, to ask questions or any advice, like I'm always happy to talk with anybody. In fact, one of the things I love the most is connecting with other startup community builders around the country or world, just to share, to knowledge share, and just to meet and greet type of thing. So, you can contact me via the village website, which is kcsv.org.
Okay.
If you want more, like on the foundation, kcstartupfoundation.org. Some other things to really keep your finger on the pulse of what's happening in Kansas City, and to kind of maybe even get some more, lessons or guidelines, or just kind of keep, understand what's happening here. Check out startlandnews.com. That's startlandnews.com. And it's a digital publication that covers all the innovation that's happening in Kansas City, and they do a fantastic job of covering what's happening here. So really, really neat publication.
That's great, man. Well, I really appreciate you taking the time under your busy day to be on the show, and I look forward to keeping in touch with you and, seeing where you guys go with this thing, because you guys have been on an awesome, exciting journey so far, and, it seems like it's continuing and it's going to be even better in the coming years.
Yeah, well, I appreciate being on the show, and I think and I hope you're right. I mean, I feel like the village is always on an upward trajectory, and Kansas City's startup ecosystem really is the same thing. And so, keep your eye on Kansas City, and if you want to find out more, if you're ever in town, like definitely reach out. We love going to get barbecue with visitors.
Sure, man. That sounds awesome.
Cool.
All right, man. Well, you have a good rest of the day. We'll talk soon.
Okay. Thanks, Evan.
Yeah. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. The music for the show is done by Electric Mantra. You can check them out at electricmantra.com and keep building the future.